So, yeah, as I was saying, I absolutely adored Charlie. I thought he was so interesting as a character, and yet one that is wordless.
I'm really, really, I say I'm really fond of Charlie, and I think he came from a lot of places because I was, so that was 2013, which is a little while ago now, and
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
yeah, I was reading a lot of Neil Gaiman at that time and a lot of China Mieville, so I was definitely kind of going down a weird path, but also you
Down
had,
a platform, I suppose.
yeah, very much so.
Appropriate, really.
But you had around about that time, so I think it was maybe a few years after that, but you had the London riots going on, and there was a lot going on in London at the time. And as somebody sort of who grew up and was born and raised in London, so I'm very. I think that there is something about being a Londoner that you do become kind of attached to the city, kind of almost physically attached to it, because
I've heard that a lot from people
yeah,
who were born there, who grew up there, who have lived there for a significant amount of time. It's almost as though there's a kind of symbiotic
yeah,
quality that
I really do
happens.
believe that, and I live in Essex now, and luckily I still work in London, so
Yeah.
I that connection is still there. But if I were ever to sort of stop working in London and not go there, I would. I think you'd feel it physically like a missing
Yeah.
limb. You do when you've grown up there, or when you, as you said, spent a significant amount of time there. It gets into you. And I don't know if it's because you literally breathe it in, or I don't know how
Yeah.
it works, but there is some transference. Nothing with Charlie, it was kind of, the weird thing about me is I never consciously set to write anything. It's only kind of as I'm writing it, or even afterwards, sometimes years afterwards, that I look
Yeah.
back and I realise what that was about. And I think Charlie was about that. It was about um, that kind of attachment that Londoners have to London, but manifested in this kind of in this creature that absorbs and reflects.
Absolutely, yeah, and I love the way that Charlie is simultaneously he's a vessel for the ethos and the mood of the city, and in the story that's quite negative. It's negatively manifested, but there's a suggestion in the story that it doesn't have to be that way.
Yeah, definitely. And
You
I
know?
I think that again, I think that comes from being a lifelong Londoner as well, because you see a lot of good and you see a lot of bad.
Yeah, of course.
My granddad, he always said to me that he, sincerely believed that London was the best city in the world because anything you want you can find, any kind of music,
Yeah.
any kind of cuisine, any kind of art or literature, anything you
Uh-huh.
want you can find in London. And so you've got that side of it, which is this wonderful multicultural, this melting pot of a city, which and all the best parts of
Yeah.
that phrase. But then you do have things like you have riots, you have stabbings, you have all these kind of
Of
terrible
course,
stuff.
extreme poverty and
Yeah, there's,
disparity.
I know it's popular to think of London as this, rich centre of Britain where all politicians hang out, but I grew up in a very poor part of London, so I know
Yes.
firsthand that there is extreme poverty. No, I wasn't extreme poverty, but I've seen extreme poverty.
Well, the story kind of reflects that too, doesn't it? Because the protagonists they operate in what is essentially it's a squat, isn't it? They're actually squatting, and they are themselves runaways. They're all strays. They have no anchorage. They have no home. They have nothing. And what I loved about the story is the way they kind of stray into this strange mythology that's linked to the city. They're not really part of it, but they become part of it. And in fact, the protagonist, the narrator, she is outside of the mythology to begin with, and then becomes inextricably drawn into it.
Definitely. And I think, again, something I realised after writing it was that nobody in that story has agency to begin
Yeah.
with, and they find agency. And it's about sort of what I think there's a thread underneath it of what we do with agency and how we use our agency. So you've got Mercy who uses her agency to try and remove Charlie, and then you've
Of
got the
course.
narrator Hannah who uses her agency not only to restore Charlie but to start again and do it better this time. And I think that
Yeah. And I really liked as well that the story is like a lot of the stories in this collection actually is non-judgmental. It's not like a moral screed or anything like that. It's never didactic. It never actually like finger wags or anything to that effect. So Mercy may be right. She may have been correct in her, I suppose, her kind of abortion of Charlie. Um,
I think the way Mercy sees it is that it's the greater good. She
yeah.
removed Charlie for everybody else's sake, and I think she genuinely believed that what she was doing was the right thing, not just for her, but for everybody
but for
else.
London, for the city, because of course she has seen what happens when he wakes up, when you have this extreme, almost like metaphysical negativity spreading throughout. In fact, it is the riots, isn't it, that does spur her to her eventual murder of Charlie.
Yeah,
Spoilers,
it's
by
not
the way,
until she
ladies and
sees
gentlemen.
spoiler alert, yeah. It's not until she sees people hurting one another that she acts. And I think, my take, I think I would want people to take away, and I think this is actually true for pretty much all of my stories, is that there isn't necessarily a good guy or a bad guy. It's just people doing what
No.
people do. And sometimes people do good things and sometimes people do bad things. Sometimes they do bad things for good reasons.
Yep.
There's infinite levels of complexity. And not that again, not that I set out to put infinite levels of complexity in there, but I think it's just important to me to kind of sit back and let people do what they do without imposing my judgment as a writer, because it's not my job to judge. If the reader wants to judge, that's absolutely fine, but it's not my job to put that judgment in the reader's head.
Yeah, that it's something that resonates throughout the collection. By the way, ladies and gentlemen, we are here discussing "Sing Your Sadness Deep" by Laura Mauro, who is here chatting away with me. If you haven't read this short story collection, please do so. There will be links down below. But yes, it is something I really took away from the entire collection. The fact that in every single story, the characters, they are often these quite lost people. They're quite diffident people. They tend to be outside of the general flows and rhythms of culture and of society. They are apart somehow. And yet they find themselves often just straying into these hidden metaphysics or mythologies that are part and parcel of the way culture or reality works.
Yeah, I think I've always written about the outsider, and I've always written about because, and I guess you do put a lot of yourself into stories,
Of
intentionally or
course.
unintentionally, and I've always been quite open about the fact that when I was younger and I was at school, I was an outsider. I was bullied at school. I was very very much an outsider. So it's something that's as an experience. I guess you write what you know, whether you intend to or not, and what I
Of
know is
course,
being
yeah.
outside. But also, so I think I've said this before as well. But there's so my favourite book in the world is Moomin Lad Midwinter by Tove Jansson, one of the Moomin books.
Right.
And even as an adult, it's my favourite book in the world. And there's a line in it where she says something about, and I'm going to try and quote from memory here, and I will get it wrong, but she talks about these. So it's about the Moomin. Moomin wakes up in the winter. He's meant to be hibernating through the winter, and it's he wakes up and it's strange and it's frightening and dark and all of that.
Uh-huh.
And he meets these strange creatures that only come out in the winter. And one of the characters says to him that they're night animals that don't fit in with other people, and they keep out of the way in the year, and then when everything is quiet and everyone else is asleep, that's when they come out.
That's their time, yeah.
And I guess I've always identified with the night animals, and I want to write about the night animals.
And that's very clear. That's very clear in the book, because almost every single character in these stories they operate on the periphery. They operate in hinterlands, on the very edges of society, often on the ragged edges of society, where there's very little. I was actually rereading the story this afternoon, in the City of Bones, which I absolutely love, because I like the way that you're not entirely certain what the status of the narrator is for the longest time. It doesn't actually point out specifically until quite deep into the story that she actually has harlequin ichthyosis. Because she doesn't really think of it in those terms. She thinks of herself in this inhuman way. And I love the sense of, not only is she on the edge of humanity in a very literal sense, in the sense that she almost defines as sub or abhuman, but in a geographical way too.
Yeah, absolutely. She's literally on the periphery of the world, in this
Yeah.
terribly liminal place in the middle of Siberia that exists and doesn't exist at the same time.
Yeah, it's almost unreal. It's almost like a dream state, isn't it? It's not entirely real. And again, this is something that seems to be consistent from story to story. Although each of the stories has its own self-contained mythology and metaphysics, there is a consistent theme, which is this notion of the internal world of the characters altering or influencing the external.
So I wonder if this is something that shines through as well, because so this is what you're describing there is almost I don't know if you've ever heard of magical thinking.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, an obsessive compulsive disorder, which I have, and I specifically have the magical thinking part of it. And what magical thinking does is it makes you believe that your thoughts and your your actions somehow magically influence the world around you in these kind of huge, as you put out, metaphysical is the right word for it. So one of the magical thinking compulsions I had was that I couldn't walk on 3 drains in a row, because somehow that would cause somebody that I love to die or to.
So it would have some sort of, I don't know, almost like a Kabbalistic quality to it. It's like a spell, almost.
It is like a spell. That's exactly right. But you never know what the spell is, and you never know what the effect of the spell is going to be, and it changes. That's kind of the magic of OCD, is that new things. So when I got rid of that one, I had a new one pop up, which was that I couldn't, I'd had the same set of earrings in for 3 years. I couldn't take them out. I couldn't change them, because if I did that, again, something nebulously terrible would happen.
So you think this is sort of influencing the mythologies of the stories, yeah?
Yeah, the way that you describe it, there's kind of a weird joy in listening to other people kind of tell me what they see in my stories, because like I said, I don't consciously put anything in, I just write the story. So when people tell me this is what I saw, I kind of I'm able to see what parts of myself I've put in it, because you're telling me. I can't, yes, I have no objectivity, because I wrote the story, but you're giving me this objective perspective, and it's fascinating and also kind of terrifying, because the stories are basically me.
I think that's what makes them work, though. There is something very earnest in the stories. There is a kind of genuine raking of the subconscious here. They're trying to explore. They seem to be trying to explore things that are often within this kind of genre fiction, are often forbidden or are often not really explored in this way. There is, Sing Your Sadness Deep tends to be marketed under horror, generally speaking, and I can see that, but in a way that is, in terms of the assumptions that would bring up or elicit, that's entirely false, because there's such a degree of ambiguity here. The assumptions that people would have of the short stories based on what has gone before or what predominates the genre would in fact be proven false by the stories themselves.
Which is interesting, because I wonder if that's a failing in our perception of horror. I've always fit sort of sideways into horror, because I will quite happily wear the horror writer hat. I love horror. It's a genre that I feel at home in. It's a genre I feel at home writing. But my stories fit sideways into horror, because there are horrific elements, and there are horrific. So at the moment, I'm just finishing up my master's dissertation, and what I'm doing an awful lot of reading into, as well as liminal spaces, which I am slightly obsessed with, and again, will probably shine through.
I can see, definitely.
Is the idea of the uncanny, but beyond that, the weird and the eerie, which is, and I will plug a wonderful book here by an author, sadly no longer with us, Mark Fisher, called The Weird and the Eerie, which goes into this a little bit more and kind of looks at how horror, or what we might describe as horror adjacent fictions, have, horror and dread are 2 affects. But then you've got weird, and you've got eerie, and you've got uncanny, and all of those operate broadly under a horror umbrella. But we only ever really think of dread and horror. We don't think of the others. And I think that's, that's why I think I do ultimately fit into horror. I just fit into one of the lesser explored.
Yes, and as you said, in a kind of sideways way. I like that a lot, actually. I really like that a lot. And it's something that, as I said before, that I think there are bigger markets and bigger appetites for than most people would acknowledge or most people would realise. I think there is a genuine desire amongst horror audiences for this kind of material, for the strange, for the ambiguous, something that isn't as prescribed, perhaps, or something that isn't quite as standard. As you were mentioning earlier, one of the things I love about this collection, and it's something that attracts me to a lot of the short stories, the novels, the media in general, that I really celebrate, is the ambiguity of it. These stories, there are not moral condemnations or celebrations of anything as such.
Yeah, no, that's not that. That's not what I set out to do. I guess I'm setting out to observe. That's mostly what I do. I observe, and and I try to interpret. So, earlier on you said something really interesting about the main character in the City of Bones, and I think with her, what I was trying to sort of set out was the difference of perspective that we have of ourselves and that other people have of us, and that we build our perceptions of ourselves so very often on what we're told about ourselves.
What we're told, of course, and she has absolutely no choice because of how limited her experience of anything is. She is literally, I mean, she is, everything about her from the moment she is born is prescribed for her, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. She's told, from day one that she is monstrous, and that she is, she's freakish. And of course, when I did a lot of research into harlequinic theosis, including interviews with people who live with the condition, and
Wow.
it's fascinating. And what is quite obvious is that these are not monstrous individuals in any way, shape, or form. They are, just like everybody else. They are complex and they're fascinating, and they live fascinating lives. But the common thread is that they are other people. There's this kind of external monstering of people because of the way they look, and I think in the City of Bones, even the people who care for her ostensibly keep her under this veil of monstrosity because it allows them to keep them where they want her to be.
Yes, there is a distancing quality, isn't there? And all of them do it. Even Matvey, even her ostensible father figure, who does have some affection for her, it seems, some legitimate affection. He has that very interesting quirk where he names her after the cycles of the moon. Which it's a way of slightly dehumanizing her.
Yeah, it was the idea of that, and that very nearly actually came out in editing, but I kind of fought to keep it because I liked the idea that this man had intended her to be a tool and had never intended to actually care for the child in any way, but came to care for the child, but to keep that distance. He gives her different names, and so as to almost that she's a different person each time, or a different monster each time, perhaps. To keep himself, and I think there's also the thread underneath there of the fact that people with harlequinic theosis, in the modern day, they live into adulthood, but in conditions such as that, it's unlikely that she would live beyond her 20s. So I think there's that emotional distancing as well. This child will die.
Of course, so it's a way of self-protection in a way. I cannot build any kind of relationship with this person because it's going to be taken away.
Yeah, so even there, it's Matvey's his you can't necessarily blame him, even though on the surface what he's doing seems cruel, and it is cruel. There is a cruelty in it, but there's also a genuine love, and there's that kind of complexity of.
Yeah, because he is a very distant character, actually. You don't see much of him because, of course, he's away for most of the story. You see him through her eyes, as it were, and the sort of the archetype that he is to her. What I loved about her voice as the narrator is that she is so sanguine. There's a sage-like quality to her that's brought about by her distance from everything. She knows about the world. She's never really experienced it, but she knows about it in a kind of dreaming way because of what she's read and what she's been taught, and because of these strange broadcasts that she interprets. And I loved that. I love how sanguine she is about everything. Like when her friend is trying to convince her to leave, only temporarily, because there's something unusual happening, there's something potentially harmful happening, and she just kind of shrugs and says, "This is my home, I'm not going anywhere."
But I think she only knows so much, and she only knows the world. Her world is very small, I think, is what I'm trying to say, and she knows there is a world beyond her world, but she's never experienced that world beyond her world. So when Dren tries to convince her to leave, it's the idea is. This is her world. There's theoretically things outside of her world, but she doesn't know that for sure. This is, and also there's also the thread underneath it that what she's doing is terribly important,
of course,
to her within her context. So, and it's
doesn't she say at one point? Doesn't she actually say to the reader that Matvey gave her humanity?
Yeah, and therefore he's the closest thing to God.
Yeah. Of course. So there is this entire, slightly strange, like Abrahamic metaphysics running underneath that, for better or for worse. I mean, and again, it demonstrates this incredible ambiguity of the situation, where what Matvey has done is simultaneously positive and negative. It's simultaneously cruel and kind.
I think that's exactly it. It is cruel and kind, and you could easily condemn him or condone it at any point in the story, and you could be right.
Yeah. There are not many unambiguously, say, hateful or cruel characters in these short stories. I mean, the closest I think you ever come is in Sundogs, where you have the male characters riding around with their shotguns and their, when they are rather threatening male archetypes. But even then, there is this quality about them where they are just like children.
Well, also the thing is, I think from their perspective, in a very kind of primitive macho bullshit kind of way, they are trying to protect people, because from their point of view, children are being killed. There's a genuine threat, and absolutely the way they deal with it is
Wrong. It's totally wrong.
I'm going to say suboptimal, but yes, wrong is a better word for it. But there is still at the core of it a nugget of something that you might be able to say, I understand.
Yes, I mean, they're kind of flailing, aren't they? They're scared because something is happening that they don't understand. They're actually quite threatened by it. It's undermining their assumptions of the world. And they're reacting in this threatening way, and it's very interesting that they act in a threatening way towards the isolated female characters.
Yeah. I think
Very interesting.
there's a real thread of if you spend any amount of time on the internet, then and you'll see the way that a lot of, and I'm, qualifier, not all men, but, a lot of men.
On this podcast, you don't need to make that qualifier. You don't need to make that qualifier. I'm well aware.
But, it's the way that they react to women with any kind of power.
Well, not even just presence. I mean,
presence, that's a much better word, actually. Yeah.
A very good example would be the Gamergate bullshit, I mean, it's
daring to exist in what they perceive as their domain.
Sandpit, basically. It is this infantile temper tantrum which becomes violent very quickly, like graphically, misogynistically violent very quickly. It descends into threats of mutilation and of rape and of violence that is very particularly against women.
And very, very deeply personal. There's always it's never just, I'm going to come and punch you in the face. It's always, there's something deeply graphically bodily about it, if that makes sense. It's always it's never any kind of, it's the person making the threat is so deeply connected to that threat and involved with that threat that you sense that how personal it is for them. And I think that's what I'm trying to kind of express, is that it's the reason that they react that way is out of a visceral fear. There is a genuine fear here.
It's like a phobic reaction, isn't it?
Phobic reaction, that someone is taking away their power or their status, but something is being taken from them, and they're afraid of that, and that manifests in this kind of violent, as you say, violent misogyny, and that kind of comes across. I tried to make it come across, hopefully, in Sundogs, where
absolutely
it's not just the way that they react to June, who they perceive as being a threat because of what she is, but the way they react to Sadie as being a lone female, because there's a disdain for her.
She shouldn't be that, should she? In their world, she shouldn't be that. That's weird. And also she's trespassing on male territory, isn't she?
Yes, exactly. And when I was doing research for that, I fell down some really interesting rabbit holes on that one about preppers, and it's just a weird world, and it is there are lots of women preppers, don't get me wrong, but it is a heavily masculine world full of guns and ammo and kind of reinforced fortresses that when the end times come, you're just going to shoot the crap out of everybody and take what you want.
Course, yeah.
So really, Sadie is an anomaly in that world, I think, in a lot of ways.
Like ideologically as well, because she's not out there with some grand idea or myth of what she's doing as such. She's kind of trying to survive.
wants to get away, and I think a lot of it is getting away from the person that they tried to make her when she was growing
Yes.
up.
Yeah.
And I feel like, obviously, I've never had prepper parents, but I can imagine there must be a lot of psychic damage that is
I
done to you at that
Well,
age.
it's naturally isolating, isn't it, by its very nature? And to be told by the people that you, obviously, as a child, you automatically regard as the gods of your world, which are your parents, that this is correct and that this is the way to live and that everything outside is wrong. And then to realise that they are wrong, that there is something else. Yeah, it must be terrible. I mean, I can't imagine.
There's a line in there where she says something about when she was 10, she could, run a mile and do 100 press ups or something. I can't remember the exact line, but I actually took that from a prepper forum where the children of preppers, or the grown up children of preppers, were discussing what their childhood was like in retrospect.
Wow.
And there was a lot of fucked up stuff in that thread. I mean, a lot of people looking back on their childhood and realizing what they thought was normal was not normal. And the idea that they would check the moon before they went to bed every night because a red moon, I think it was the sign of the impending apocalypse, and that was the end times. It just, the amount of damage that people are doing to their children. And again, the hard thing about that is that these preppers, again, genuinely believe that what they're doing is right and
It's
what they're
correct.
and that they're protecting their children. So
Yeah, that makes it far more difficult, doesn't it? It makes it far more problematic. It would be so easy on a moral or ideological level if they were insincere.
and you could say, you are evil fantasists and you're damaging your children on purpose, but
But it's not true, is it?
it isn't that simple. And it's from an outsider's point of view, it's so tempting to write off as that, but there's something so much deeper under it. And I think it's a very specifically American mentality.
Definitely. Well, I imagine a lot of it derives from the natural wilderness of America, that sort of frontiersship quality that it has. There are so many empty spaces in the US where it's possible to disappear, where it's possible to set up your own commune or your own little world. A little bit more difficult here, I imagine.
And when you look at apocalyptic fictions, the reason I think that so much of it is set in America and not in the UK or Europe, as broader Europe, is because you've got these wide swathes of empty, unoccupied forest or plain or something. In the UK, when you get post-apocalyptic narratives, it's usually located in a city, and you get that kind of decaying
urban,
cityscape.
isn't it?
It's very urban, yeah, and it's
Yeah.
just a different kind of story. So you get, like the Stand, for example. You couldn't have the Stand. The Stand couldn't happen in the UK,
In the UK,
and
no,
it probably couldn't happen in Europe, even though there is more empty space in Europe, but not in that same way. Not in
No, and it's not even geographical, is it? It's psychological more than anything. It's that notion. Yeah, that's absolutely incredible to think about. There's some wonderful stuff to play with there.
Oh, yeah, I'd love to see a real European apocalypse, because I think one thing that I think you would probably find in a European apocalypse is a great, and this is purely hypothetical and speculation, but I think you would find people erring more towards the side of forming communities rather than breaking off, because
Yes.
that's the way that Europe has operated for thousands of years. It's
Absolutely, and I think it's an unusual thing, isn't it? But when you look back at, say, the extended history of Europe, which is, as you say, thousands and thousands of years, it is in a very real sense already post-apocalyptic, in the sense that it's had that.
the fall of the Roman Empire was a minor apocalypse in it.
The Black Plague, obviously.
Yeah, it's so many, and
Two.
World War One and World War Two, and and then within that you've got sort of microcosms of apocalypse. Of individual nations and individual. The fall of the Soviet Union, for example,
Yes.
must have felt apocalyptic in a way to the people who lived it there. And then even more minor apocalyptic events like Chernobyl. A microcosm of a microcosm. So, and it's just, I think there's a. And I that's not to say that I think all Americans are individualistic and all Americans. I think you would find community spirit in America, and I think you would find that. But I just think that there's a reason that so much apocalyptic fiction comes out of America, and that it is configured in the way that it is configured.
Yeah, it's very particular, isn't it? It's very particular, and I think it talks to something within American history, and just within the broader sense of identity that the USA has. And I mean, I do actually really enjoy that kind of thing. It's so interesting because, of course, as a British person, it's something that we don't really have in the same way.
It's alien, isn't it? And I do genuinely. I have a real fondness for things like Southern Gothic and
Sort of like
American.
Americana, yeah?
Yeah, and particularly as it applies to horror fiction, because there's a certain, like for example, that kind of the religious terror
Yeah.
that you get in a lot of American horror fictions that we just don't have an equivalent for over
No.
here. And even Catholic religious terror is different to American religious terror, and from a horror perspective, it's absolutely fascinating and it's so alien to me. And I think it's peculiarly horrific to people who aren't experienced or aren't versed in that kind of religious mode.
That's sort of like the background of Puritanism and of the yeah,
Speaking
absolutely.
in tongues, and where you start getting into this almost pagan expressions of Christianity.
Well, did you have that? I mean, I know I had this really odd experience when I was about sort of 2021 when I really started to delve into, largely thanks to the internet, the notion of sort of American revivalism and fundamentalist Christianity and that very peculiar kind of evangelical Christianity. And I didn't know it existed.
No, I had no idea. Genuinely, it was, and do you know what? I think it was around about the time of 9/11 that
Yeah.
sort of stuff started coming to my attention, because I think the revivalism had a revival after.
It did a big old revival. It really did.
That's when I think, and also with the internet being the way that it was at that time, we had greater access to what was going on in America, and a lot of what was going on in America was this very tub thumping, aggressively Christian.
Very strange. It was very strange. I'd never come across it before. Up till that point, my experience of Christianity was kind of Church of England and Catholicism. It's that kind of slightly wet behind the ears, let's go and have a sandwich and a cup of tea on Sunday kind of Christianity.
Yeah, I think the worst I'd ever experienced was Irish Catholic. My family are Irish, and
Yeah.
the Irish Mass, which is a long and miserable affair, which mostly involves being told you're going to hell. But even that's par for the course. You're going to be told you're going to hell, and it's you can sit there uncomfortable in the pews for 2 hours and listen to some man drone on. You know what you're getting from that.
Yeah.
You don't expect people to start fainting in the aisles and talking in the voice of the devil, and all this.
I didn't believe it when I first saw that stuff. I had a really strong visceral reaction, and I thought, this is not real. This cannot be true. It cannot be real. And what actually happened was I actually met a group of American fundamentalists on my university campus, and I was fascinated by them. I remember sitting down and having a coffee with them and saying to them, "Look, I'm gay. I'm an atheist, and I'm just I don't I'm not." I don't want to be rude or to be challenging to you or anything. I just want to know what it's all about, because I don't know. This is not what I know of as Christianity. It's an alien thing.
It is, and it's it. I suppose the most it is cloaked in Christianity, but it's not like any Christianity I've experienced.
It's not an historical Christianity, is it? It's a new thing. It's a kind of new phenomena, and that kind of sent me down the rabbit hole of that particular subject because I couldn't get enough of it after that. I mean, I thought it was just so interesting.
There's
So interesting.
there's so much about America that's interesting from I think a British perspective, because it's like us but different. See, this is where uncanny comes back, because uncanny is defined as the strange within the familiar, right? That's how Freud described it, and I think America is an uncanny nation because it's familiar, it's intimately familiar in some ways, and yet there is so much strangeness interwoven with that familiarity. There's things that exist that should not exist almost, or
Yes, yeah. I think because we share a language, there does tend to be this assumption that we're going to be culturally broadly similar.
And there are enough similarities that you can kind of comfortably sit alongside it, but then all of a sudden, I think it's like looking into a cracked mirror. You know, everything
Yeah.
looks about right, and then you look a little bit, and then you realise, hang on a second, everything's distorted.
Yeah, and I'm sure it works the other way as well.
Yeah, I know for a fact that it does. You know, I've got enough American friends who, you know, occasionally message me to go, why do British people?
Why do British people act this way? Why do they do this?
And at least 50% of the time, I just go, I don't know either. You know,
Yeah, absolutely. I think that may be a major difference, actually, because you were talking earlier about your sort of outsider status, which informs a lot of these stories and a lot of your writing, and I think that's something that the vast majority of people writing in horror and in genre fiction in general have, actually, that sense that they are not parts of the cultures or the societies into which they were born, ostensibly. But I find that in the UK, there are so many people who are apart from the weirdness or have that capacity to just stand back and say, British people are just strange. There's something very, very odd about our culture and about the way we react to things, about the little absurdities in the way we go about our day-to-day lives and the way we interact. Our emotional lives are strange.
we're a very weird nation of people, and I think that's only got worse with Brexit. I think that's really provoked an awful lot of soul searching in British people and the realization that we are far stranger and far more fucked up than we actually gave ourselves credit for.
I think I totally agree. I think what Brexit has done, I mean, for better or for worse, it has held up a mirror to the nation. It has made quite a lot of us look at ourselves again and look at ourselves collectively, and realize that there is something almost deranged about us. There's something broken here. Fundamentally broken.
It's been a really depressing time. It has, and but that's also quite fertile stuff for horror fiction, because I think horror fiction thrives when we are looking at ourselves and unpicking our assumptions. You know, I think I saw someone on Twitter today, and I must find out who it was so I can credit them, who said that horror is an exercise in radical empathy.
Oh, I like that. Oh, that's lovely.
Beautiful, isn't it? That really. Hang on, I'm just going to have a quick look. Sorry, I'm on Twitter now. It's Doug Morano at Morano Fiction. He said, "Horror at its best is an exercise in radical empathy. No other genre has quite the same potential to teach us about our common humanity."
Oh, that's.
And that's spot on to me. And I think part of that also is when we unpick what's wrong and when we unpick the things that we're ashamed of or afraid of. Or
well, that's horror is really at its very best is made for that, isn't it? When it's at its bravest, when it's at its most sincere, it's allowing us to explore what we can't in day-to-day discourse, or what we disallow ourselves from for fear of shame, of judgment, or of whatever. It's when we turn the eye inward and we say, yeah, this muck, this filth, this psychosis is me. It's part of me. It's who I am. It's so funny. I was not to get too personal, but I've started dating a chap recently, and he doesn't do horror. He's not really a horror guy. He finds it kind of distressing. And I was trying.
That's fair.
Yeah, absolutely, totally. And I was trying to explain to him this exact thing, because he was saying to me, "Well, you're such a cuddly guy. Where does it come from? You know, where does this obsession with darkness and kind of the inner excrement of the soul come from?" And I was trying to explain to him that, yes, but would the reason I am kind of cuddly and kind of jovial is because of that. I'm in touch with the darkness, I'm in touch with the negative things, and I don't shy away from them. I allow myself that, even if it is vicariously through horror fiction, through video games, through movies, through whatever, you know?
No, I agree with you. I absolutely agree with you. And funny enough, you know, my husband's not a massive horror buff. You know, I think the only horror he really goes near is my writing, and that's because he kind of has to.
Or he hasn't got a choice. He hasn't got a choice.
But and I think it's a similar thing there. I think you're totally right in what you're saying, in that I think allowing yourself to feel these things and allowing yourself to acknowledge these things means that I think it's a very healthy thing potentially to be able to do, because the opposite of that is suppressing it. and pretending that it doesn't exist. And I think obviously, caveat here is it depends where you come from, what your mind is like, what your, how you come to the genre. Because, for me, I had a, difficult childhood, a difficult adolescence, difficult teenage years. So I came to horror with a lot of baggage and and I think actually I was drawn to horror because of that baggage, in the same way that I was drawn to metal music and the other things I'm interested in, and because it was a safe, and it's a much maligned phrase, I know, but I'm going to use it because I think it's an important phrase. It is a safe space, and I think the idea of a safe space has been warped into something that is a sanitized space, but a safe space is not a sanitized space. A safe space is a space in which you are allowed to explore the things that hurt you or the things that scare you in your own time at your own pace.
That's it. That's what people don't understand, isn't it? People who malign the notion of safe spaces, that's what they actually don't understand.
It's never about avoiding. It's about exposing yourself bit by bit to these things, as
It's providing an arena, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. And I think horror has allowed me to, both as a reader or consumer of horror fictions and as a writer of horror fictions, to process an awful lot of things that I would not have had an outlet for otherwise. Well, I mean, excepting for very long and very verbose therapy sessions. But this is cheaper. This is cheap.
I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. That's pretty much everything I always say to people. It's cheaper than getting a therapist.
It really is. I mean, Sing Your Sadness Deep is like 13 or 14 stories. But it's basically, it's therapy on paper.
Well, some of the stories very literally. I mean, I look at The Grey Men as an example. I mean, here you have a narrator who is dissatisfied with the world and with himself, with everything about his reality, and that despair alters it. It leaks out. It actually becomes a phenomena within the world, and the world becomes a kind of canvas or a projection for his dissatisfaction and his despair.
And I think there's an undercurrent in that, in that the Grey Men are representative of the fact that he isn't alone, and there are many people who feel that way. But obviously, in his isolation, he takes it to mean that the Grey Men are him and him alone, and that it's just him. But the idea is that it's a shared.
It's collective, isn't it? It's a collective. The Grey Men.
Very important for me to make the protagonist male, because I generally write female protagonists. It's just, I don't know. I don't think there are enough of them, and I think women deserve to be explored in as complex beings. But it was really important for that protagonist to be male because, of course, as we know, depression and suicide rates among men are extremely high, and it's not something that's talked about. So it was important for me to sort of have that perspective and to have that, to be open about it and to express it in that way, and to also to show that sort of sense of it is shared, it is common, it is a phenomenon that everybody is experiencing in some form or another.
Yes, and I really enjoyed that story because the very particular kind of ennui that he is experiencing is it's not uniquely male, but it's peculiarly male. That diffidence, that inability to fulfill something fundamental within yourself, and not even being able to identify it. Why? What is it? Why can I not connect to reality? Why can I not connect to the world in the ways that other people do? Yeah.
And I think that's a very real experience, because I think the popular kind of conception of things like depression and that is that there's a thing, inciting incident or an inciting some kind of trigger point. And I'm sure that often sometimes there is, but sometimes it is just that the world is too much.
Yeah, it is just, and it's not even like external things happening, which is something again that the story captures really well. It's the fact of existence.
Yes.
It's the fact of conscious existence. It's the burden of conscious existence, and
and the exhaustion.
The exhaustion of having to wake up every morning and having to think and having to feel things, and that's that again, it goes back to what you were talking about earlier, where horror is so uniquely placed to explore these things that it's a crying shame that it so often doesn't. there is a fundamental horror to existence as a bit of conscious matter.
Exactly. We are piloting meat suits. We are floating brains piloting meat suits, deeply inadequate, really, when you think about the purpose they're supposed to serve. We arguably be better off floating around in glass jars, but from a purely existential point of view, what the fuck are we doing here? What is going on?
Exactly, and that's exactly that kind of flailing philosophical confusion where we're able to project ourselves, we're able to imagine things of such incredible transcendence and transgression and horror and dread and despair.
80% of us spend all of our days shouting at people on Twitter. It's just
or staring at the television or
whatever. I do a lot of this kind of flailing. I'm a very flaily kind of person. It's and I think as a sort of related thing, horror has got a really temperamental relationship with mental health. And I kind of wanted to rehabilitate that a little bit because, the trope of the madman or the psychopath, and
it's everywhere, isn't it?
And we see reflected in real life, because as soon as you get a mass shooting in America, the argument is when the argument is not video games, the argument is mental health. And
mental health,
and I'm sitting here as somebody who has several mental health diagnoses. Who has never shot a person, would never shoot a person, would never even stab a person with a fork. It's just
likewise, it's a strange thing, isn't it? It's a strange thing to find that so much of what you are or what you enjoy or what you consume is now being stigmatized.
And I do feel like, to a certain point, horror has got something to answer for in this arena. And I don't think it's horror as a genre. I think horror, because horror is, genre is a tool, and horror is a tool, and it serves the purpose that you bend it to. And it's so easy to take a psychopath or a madman and turn him into a figure of fear. It's very easy to do that because we fear what's different, and we fear the abject. And for those of us who've been fortunate enough never to experience mental health issues, the mentally ill are abject. They're a terrible thing to be feared. So it's easier for us to turn them into these kind of caricatures of evil and murder and
yes, almost the postmodern equivalents of demons or of witches or whatever.
They are the Frankenstein of our generation. They're monstrous, but we never. It's easier to do that than it is to empathise. And and sometimes that's done very well. I think I'm not condemning that trope in its entirety. I mean,
it can be done well. It can be done beautifully, and has been done beautifully in the past. But too often, it's reductive and it's prescriptive, and it just doesn't. It doesn't tell you anything. That
doesn't tell you anything. And there's nothing worse. Yeah, absolutely. There's nothing worse than a horror story that is hollow on the inside.
Absolutely, yeah. I could not agree more. I mean, as I was saying before we came on, there are certain things I absolutely seek out at this point because I'm so saturated with horror fiction. I consume it so much and have consumed it so much since I was a child. There are certain things I absolutely latch onto and seek out, and that is it's almost difficult. It's almost ineffable. It's difficult to describe, but it is an X factor. It's stories that have meaning, that have a genuine freight and earnestness to them, that want to tell you something, that want to change you somehow. They're not didactic, they're not finger wagging, they're not sort of like sitting there like a school lesson telling you.
And the lesson that it teaches you is the lesson that you personally take away from it, and that's the power of a good story. I mean, there's so many writers out there that are doing this so well. I mean, Georgina Bruce, for example, This House of Wounds, and there's I mean, all of her stories are wonderful, but there's a particular story in that called Cat World, which just destroyed me completely and continues to destroy me every time I read it. And I may take away a different lesson from that, or a different message from that other people take away, but And that's but there is a message. There is a message in there. It's like receiving a radio transmission, but you've got to decode it.
Yeah.
Without a manual and without a Rosetta Stone, you've just got to kind of, what does this mean?
Yeah, you have to engage with it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Priya Sharma's another one who does this beautifully.
She does an half.
She does, yeah. All the Fabulous Beasts, which, and we talk about how horror deals with taboos, and All the Fabulous Beasts is, several taboos that I can think of in that story, but handled with such grace
Yeah.
and such precision, and nothing in that story is what's the word? What am I thinking of? Nothing gratuitous. Nothing in that story is gratuitous. Everything is exactly where it needs to be for exactly as long as it needs to be. It is never over described. It's never oversaturated, but it's there for a reason. It's not just I'm going to stick some incest in here, or I'm going to stick some rape in there. That's my objection with a lot of rape narratives is not necessarily the fact of the rape itself, but the fact that the rape has no purpose.
It's the framing of it, isn't it? It is just there for reasons, and that's it.
Because of reasons, exactly. Yeah. When you read All the Fabulous Beasts, what happens in that story and the effect it has and the cumulative effect it has on the world, on the characters, and most importantly, I think, the way that it affects change from the beginning to the end. That's the other thing. I feel like when you're putting taboo or difficult subjects in your fiction, it has to affect change somehow. I believe that is our responsibility as a writer is to show is to show consequences, whatever that consequence might be. But I don't think you can have that as the midpoint of your story and have the person be the same person they were in the beginning and at the end.
Of course, I mean, that robs it of power, doesn't it? It robs it of any kind of meaning, In a way, it's as empty and ineffectual as the old trope of "it was all a dream."
Yes, exactly, because you've set up all of this stuff, and it was all a dream. Just where's the power in that?
Where's the power? Yeah, why did you even bother with the story in the first place, or why did you bother including this very particular, powerful and emotive subject, i.e., like something like abuse or violence or rape or whatever the subject happens to be? There needs to be some payoff. There needs to be some reason behind it. And the fact that when writers do that, when they include these incredible traumas in their stories, but they don't pay them off, they don't do it for any particular reason other than, I want to write a story about this or whatever, it diminishes them.
Or even worse, using it because I want. So, okay, how do I phrase this? There's a particular type of writer, or a particular type of reader as well, for that matter, who likes to justify the inclusion of rape scenes or abuse scenes or things like that, on the basis that A, it happens in real life, and B, I want to show how bad the world can be. Well, I mean, that's the laziest shorthand possible to show us how bad the world can be.
Absolutely.
Rape, abuse, and harming children are three of the laziest ways, because you're not you are taking the easy route. You are taking the most basic of basic tropes. If you want to show us how terrible the world can be, you can show us in a far more complex and interesting way. And to me, it shows your laziness as a writer. Yeah. That is your shorthand. That is these cultural touchstones that are so enormous now. They're basically cultural Mount Rushmores. Yeah. There's. And I'm not saying I'm not saying that you mustn't write about rape. I'm never going to say that. You write what serves your story, but does it serve your story? And what is it serving? Because if you're the only purpose you're serving is I want to show something is bad, that's not good enough.
It's not good enough, is it? It doesn't tell you anything about the phenomena. It doesn't tell you anything about the actual, or the characters, or the situation. What does... I know it sounds kind of clinical, but in the context of the story, okay, what does the rape mean?
And I'm going to be really controversial here and say that actually, I think for the most part, probably more the books than the TV series, but the TV series too, I actually think Game of Thrones handled it reasonably well when it came to rape and violence against women, because two reasons. Firstly, the female characters almost always have agency. Almost always, which is far better than most books and far better than most fantasy books.
I was going to say certainly better than most fantasy books,
which has a real problem with female characters with agency.
Oh my god, right back. I mean, way back.
I mean, I grew up reading, so my granddad used to read a lot of fantasy and sci-fi, and as you do, I was reading Stephen King at 11 years old, so I was reading deeply inappropriate books, and there was a rape all over the place in these books, and it was just a plot device. It's all it was. But and the other thing with Game of Thrones, again, I would say more the books than the TV series, but the TV series actually as well, is that there was always some kind of consequence or payoff. The rape didn't just happen in a vacuum.
No, there was always a shift, a fundamental shift in the character, wasn't there? Or in the dynamics somewhere down the line.
When you had Ramsay Bolton, spoilers for anybody who hasn't seen Game of Thrones, which but
Mm,
when you had Ramsay Bolton rape Sansa Stark, for
of
example,
course,
it
probably the
wasn't.
best example.
Yeah, it wasn't just to show us how bad Ramsay was. We know how bad Ramsay is at this point, but it was to show it was a turning point for Sansa as a
Yeah.
character. It was the breaking point for her, and it was to set into motion the events that would cause her. And it's you've got to be careful where you tread with this, because then Game of Thrones did put later on a really deeply problematic line about how where Sansa basically turned around and said, "All
Yes.
these people who abused me and raped me just made me stronger," and that's
I
also.
That's problematic. Yeah, that is really problematic. It could. The sad thing is, there is such potential there for exploring that phenomena with incredible ambiguity and a kind of dark resonance where yes they could have said that these experiences had some effect on making her what she was, but the way it's kind of celebrated.
Yeah, it was almost thanking them for doing these terrible things, and
Yeah,
it's they dropped the ball. They dropped the ball big time with
they
that one.
did. They did.
But
They did.
I think the point overall is that if you are going to put these things in your stories, if you are going to put these terrible events in your stories, you have the responsibility to make sure that you're not just throwing them around. It's not just like a family meal or someone getting in a
No.
car. It's an event that even in real life, even in 2019, has severe repercussions
Mhm.
for the person who undergoes this event. So you can't. People have got the freedom to write what they want. I'm not here telling people what they can and can't write.
Absolutely,
But I do
absolutely.
think that as if I'm talking about my peers in the writing community, then it's a case of think about the power we have and think about the responsibility we have.
That's it, isn't it? That's it. That's the thing I always think of. I have a very, very small audience for my own writing, but what I'm always very conscious of is beyond the fact that I'm asking them to give me their time and their money, I'm asking them for territory in their imagination.
Yes, that's a really good way of putting it. Actually, I like that.
It's like they're ceding a part of themselves, their consciousness to me. And if I thought about it too much, I'd stop. If I thought about it too much, it would actually cripple me completely.
Yeah. It's when you start, and this is what going back to what I was saying to you earlier on about when people are reading Sing Your Sadness Deep and they're telling me what they see in it, and it's simultaneously fascinating and wonderful, but also really really fucking frightening, because
Quite
I'm
scary, yeah.
yeah, deeply scary, because I'm putting myself in people's heads. I'm literally just like popping my
Absolutely.
little self in your brain and telling you stories about me, because and that's I guess, and also that it feels terribly vain to say that, because I don't mean for the stories to be about me, but they are about me.
Yeah, of course they are. I mean, you cannot avoid that, can you? Of course you can't.
I like to think that I don't, and then all of a sudden I like to think, no, I'm writing stories about a girl in Russia who has
Mhm.
harlequin ichthyosis, or I'm writing
Yeah.
a story about a boy on a caravan holiday with his grandparents, or I'm writing a
Uh-huh.
story about this. No, you're writing. It's about you. It's always been.
Fundamentally, it's something. It's some arena in your experience, isn't it? And even if it's just your internal experience, your fantastical experience, it's you, isn't it? It's a reflection of you. No matter how alien you try to make it, no matter how far flung you try to make it, it's part of you. But then, when people read those stories, it becomes part of them.
I know, and that's a terrible, terrible, frightening thing. Here comes that sort of with great power comes great responsibility thing again. Because
Yeah.
should I really be putting little bits of me in
Uh-huh.
people's
Yeah.
brains? Is that
That's a lesson many men could stand to learn. Really could. But yeah, I mean, I understand in that regard why it's kind of scary when people come back to you and say, I reacted to these stories in this way, because they are telling you essentially, you changed me in this way, or you touched me in this way, in like the most intimate way imaginable. This is.
you are in my brain now?
Yeah, in its own peculiar, in the cold light of logic and objectivity, the way writers and artists engage with people is so powerfully intimate. It's almost beyond like romantic contact. It's beyond any kind of like sexual contact. There is a sort of abstract union that happens.
I like to think of it as a kind of psychic transference.
Yeah.
It's like a mind meld.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's born from that is nothing that either one particularly intends. It's its own peculiar child that then goes on to spawn its own stories, and its own new imaginings. But yes, I mean, as I mentioned before I came on, I was really powerfully affected by these stories. I thought they were stunningly beautiful, and the sort of the thread of melancholia that runs throughout them, that sense of ennui, of distance from reality, from society, from humanity, and yet simultaneously a kind of unspoken celebration of that condition as well.
I can't remember who said it. It might have been Carolyn McDonald who said it. Carolyn McDonald. Sorry, Carolyn Kelly. Sorry, Carolyn McDonald Kelly is her full name. That's why I'm getting mixed up. But it said something about that I write with empathy for the monster, and I write with love for the monster.
Absolutely,
And
yeah. That's it. That's
I
really, yeah.
yeah, that was an example of someone saying something about my writing that I actually really was pleased about. Because yeah, again, never a conscious choice or a conscious decision, but
No.
I it is important. That is important to me as well. That the misfit or the outcast, and also that. So something that's really important to me is the idea that a person can be flawed and that a person can fail and that a person can be imperfect, but they are never. There is no such thing as beyond redemption, and that a person there is always grace.
Yeah.
There is always, there is always grace if you reach out.
And that's something that really does come through in these stories. I mean, even with characters that are ostensibly monstrous, on a physical or biological level. So, characters like Charlie, for example, who is described in just hideous terms. He's hideous to look at. He's diseased and he smells bad. But at the same time, there is this incredible sense of almost reverence about him. In his bathtub, in his bathroom, it's almost like a shrine.
Yeah, I think it's Charlie represents, I think, there's this kind of weird purity about Charlie because he is exactly what you make of him and nothing more and nothing less than that. And he is at the mercy of so much.
Yeah.
And and everything that Charlie is and everything that Charlie does is he has had no choice and no say. And I think Hannah says that that Charlie he has no say in what he is.
No, he doesn't. He's not a conscious god. He's not out there affecting reality around himself with design or with intent. He's like a child, isn't he?
Like a child. Yeah, he's like a child, and all he wants is to be safe. That's Charlie's need in life is to be safe. That's it.
And to be comfortable. Yeah, he wants to be sung to, doesn't he? He wants people to tell him stories and to lull him to sleep.
Because he has bad dreams, and that's it. It's not malevolence. It's something that he can't help.
Yeah,
Charlie being given a second chance at the end of that story, or the implication that Charlie will be given a second chance with somebody who perhaps understands him more.
Yeah, I think that was important, actually. It would have been a much darker story, for one thing, if it was just left, ambiguous, where they just left and there was nothing.
I usually like ambiguity, and I think a lot of my stories do end on ambiguity. But in that, and I think in an early draft of it probably was left that way. But I wanted him to have a second chance, because I kind of fell in love with Charlie a little bit when I was writing him. He's a gentle monster. He's a monster who can't help being a monster, and
the nightmares he inflicts, he's not doing it to be cruel.
Yeah, never doing it to be cruel. I think he absorbs. Don't forget, he feeds off the city as well. So I think so much of it is what he absorbs, as well as what he puts out is what he takes in.
Yeah. So how much is he just reflecting? There is what I really got out of Charlie is that notion of the scapegoat. It's almost like he's taking the sins of the city upon himself, or almost like he's a manifestation of the sins of the city.
And even his dirtiness and ugliness, there's the old Victorian trope, isn't there, of the disfigured degenerate, which is a terrible trope.
But very peculiarly Victorian.
It's very. I was doing a for my master's a module on the Gothic, and the number of times that comes up, the idea that you can see the evil person among you because they're ugly.
Someone who is diseased or scabrous, they're evil. Well, and also, I mean, it's carried on, isn't it? I mean, you look at Disney films, for example.
I always quite liked the trope of the stepmother in Snow White. The beautiful stepmother, because that turned it on its head a little bit, wasn't it?
A little bit, yeah.
Although she was still envious of beauty, so I guess it doesn't turn it on its head quite that much.
No, and she does become ugly by the end, of course.
Ugly by the end, that's true, yeah. But this isn't a peculiar thing that we see even now. I mean, when I think about Game of Thrones again with Melisandre, who appears as a beautiful woman but is a wizened crone underneath, and that's an enduring trope that comes up a lot. The woman who's actually an ugly crone underneath her beauty.
Beware of woman.
Yeah, well, beware of woman. Yeah, you could apply that to pretty much anything.
Certainly in fantasy fiction, you could.
Oh God, yeah, they're all trying to. So it reminds me of Irish, traditional Irish music, in which it was always either the fault of the English, which is reasonable, or the fault of women. Like Whiskey in the Jar. There's that bit where he steals Captain Farrell's money and he takes it home, but it's his wife's fault somehow for informing the police. You shouldn't have stolen Captain Farrell's money, you knob. It's the devil takes that woman. I've listened to way too much Irish folk music in my time, but the woman. But with Charlie, his kind of his abjectness and his ugliness and the bad smell and all of that stuff is just none of it is. It's just the way that he's made. That's all it is. It's the way that he's made, and it reflects nothing about him. And I like to think that Hannah learns that as time goes on. She's scared of him at first, but she starts talking to him and she feels empathy for him because she realizes that it's illogical to be afraid of him and to despise him just because of how he is.
And there's also a sense of responsibility there, isn't there? There's a burden. I think she starts to realize that actually this thing is almost like the child of us all. This is like the child of our collective sin. And we bear some responsibility for whatever pain he's experiencing. However, the pain that he's then reflecting back on us. It's our filth, it's our abuse, it's us,
Absolutely, and that's why it's not enough just to kill him and have it done with. That's the easy way out, and it's the wrong way.
It's the wrong way, isn't it? It's exactly it's just the same sickness, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Because, then the idea that Charlie's cyclical, he comes back because you've solved nothing, you've cured nothing. The root is still there.
It's another interesting thing about not just this story, but a lot of the stories in this collection, which is the sort of unspoken metaphysics of them. You have a lot of characters who kind of stumble into these very strange situations, or these worlds within the world, or just beyond, sort of one step removed from the world, where there is a process occurring, or there is a system that is largely unexplained and unspoken, but for which there are suggestions of what might be happening.
Yeah, and I think there are always rules. Yes. I don't always know what the rules are, but there are always rules in these worlds. There's always so when you look at something like Stranger's Angels, for example, where she finds the monster in the road, and what might feel like randomness, but it isn't random. There are rules. There are certain things that it needs to be fed in order to survive, and there's and it's certain, and it learns through her love for it how to love back, but it's a very peculiar. It's as viewed through the lens of this kind of tiny predator that's been subject to this very sort of what's the word, unhealthy love, I suppose.
There's a kind of I wouldn't say abusive, but almost there is a kind of dark relationship there, isn't there? A strange codependency.
Very much so, and I think it's in a way it is her replacing one unhealthy codependent relationship for another.
Yeah.
And projecting all of her needs and all of her failure, what she perceives as her failures. Because I think another thing that someone pointed out is that, well, I don't know if I am good at it, but somebody thinks that I'm good at it, is expressing the difference between the way a character perceives themselves and the way that other people perceive that character. Mm-hmm. And the example they used was the father in The Pain Eater's Daughter. And as he becomes sicker and sicker, and more visibly disabled, but he maintains the stoicism and he maintains
Yes.
this sense of I'm fine, I'm okay,
I'm
there's nothing
okay,
wrong with
yeah.
me, even as other people are physically recoiling from him,
Yeah.
which is interesting to me.
It's an interesting dynamic, isn't it? It really is. I mean, it sounds almost an obvious thing to say that characters within stories are not their perceptions can be distorted, so they are not viewing themselves in the way that either the reader views them or the other characters view them. But it's something that's so often not commented on.
And this is a weirdly personal thing for me as well, I think, because so I guess one of the side effects of being bullied is that I don't, obviously I can't speak for everybody who's been in this situation, God knows, but certainly one of the side effects for me is that I have a very loose sense of self. I don't really know much about who I am, even now, because I'm so used to viewing myself through other people's lens.
Of course.
And I spent 5 or 6 years being told by other people what I was and who I was and what that meant. So I think because this stuff leaves scars, obviously it does, and I think that's something that's always I've never quite got my head around the idea that you know of self-perception and the idea that you have an idea of yourself. So for me, I've always been, my sense of self has always been dependent on what other people have said about me, always. So it's interesting for me to kind of explore the idea in fiction that there is a difference between your sense of yourself and the sense of self other people have of you. But
That's very interesting. That is very interesting because, again, something I took away from these stories is most of the narrators go through this process of change where their assumptions of self at the beginning of the stories are very, very different by the end.
yeah, that's really interesting.
It's like they're in flux. It's like they're either they're in metamorphosis or they're in a kind of decay.
Yeah, they kind of it's finding yourself, but in a not always in a healthy or useful kind of way.
Or even in a kind of absolute way. Often what I find from certainly the stories in Sing Your Sadness Deep is that they find the very notion of self dissolving around them, so it just comes apart. And that's not always a bad thing.
Yeah, as I say, it's something I've lived with all my adult life, really. I know there was a point in my in my life where I did have a sense of self. I'm sure that was a thing, and I know that other people do. And I'm fairly comfortable with just floating along as a brain in a jar.
It's a great metaphor.
But like, if you asked me to describe my personality, I could probably give you a few buzzwords that I've kind of gleaned from other people, because that's how I know myself. I know myself. I'm like kind of like my self perception, like a Myers-Briggs personality test list that that I've built up from what people have told me. So
Almost like there's a magpie quality to it, isn't there? Where you're sort of taking bits and pieces and sewing them together. There's a almost Frankensteinian in a way. You're piecing together.
Constructing myself a people suit. It's but so it's really interesting that you kind of point that out as the sense of self disintegrates, because it's almost like there's me again. People, they start off like normal people and then they become me.
Well, I think it tells you something about the audience for this book as well. I think it tells you something about the people who are really going to respond to it, because I think most people who read it, who have very strong emotional reactions, will find that will have similar situations where self or identity is in flux quite often. Certainly, in my case, that is definitely barring like certain I suppose touchstones, things like the fact that I'm gay and so on and so forth. There isn't much absolute.
Yeah. I think it's one thing that I've kind of learned through being on the internet is that actually the way that I feel and my perception of myself is not as unusual as I thought. There are people out there who are also like, I've got no idea.
I think probably more than we'd ever imagine. I don't want to project too much, but I do think that personality and identity in general are things in flux rather than things that are absolute. Despite the fact that almost every aspect of our cultures and the systems in which we operate, and our media for that matter, our popular media tells us otherwise. It insists otherwise.
Yeah, it insists that we are fully formed individuals. We are fully
Yeah.
formed people. It's almost like we spring from the womb fully formed. You know, you
Yeah.
see this with so gender roles and things like that. You know, the way that we assume that because a person is born with a particular configuration of body parts, that's their destiny is therefore predicted. That's something else that is kind of, so I say I don't make a lot of conscious decisions in my writing, and that's true. But one thing I do consciously try and do is to include people. Like a spectrum of people. So I've got disabled people, I've got queer people. You know, it's important for me to represent non-binary people and queer relationships, but also queer friendships, so that it's not always. So Letters from Elodie is important because it shows a different kind of facet to a queer relationship than Sundogs, for example.
Of course, yeah.
And then also I've got other identities. You know, I consciously set out to write a story with a Romany protagonist because, you know, I've got Romany blood, so that's a personal thing. But also I wanted that experience. I wanted that experience to be put into words. So it's important to me. You know, that's the reason I chose consciously made Dren a non-binary character in the City of Bones.
Yes, of course, because they refer to Dren as they. The pronoun is they, isn't it?
And what I wanted in that is for that just to be a fact for Dren, because
doesn't the character just shrug?
Yeah, I think are you a man or a woman? And they shrug. Yeah, because that's the fact of Dren's life. And I think that's really important as well when we talk about queer identities, because there are a lot of issue stories about queer people, which is fine. There's a place for that. But, you know, as a not entirely straight person myself, it's important to have queer people just existing in stories where their where their queerness is not the story.
Where it's demystified.
Yeah, it's not the story, it's just a part of who they are. It's just like the fact they've got blue eyes, or the fact that they wear a green sweater, or the fact that they speak whatever language. It's just a part of who they are. And I want to normalise queer identities.
You know, generally speaking, it is happening. When you look at popular fiction, it is happening. It's slow.
And that's a really cool thing that I'm noticing more and more, is that it's just, you know, it used to be, oh wow, there's a lesbian in this, or there's a gay person, or and now it's just like I was watching the OA not long ago.
Yeah.
And there's a transgender character in that who's played by a transgender actor, which is superb.
Oh God, thank God! You know, it's so rare. It's so rare.
Authentic, kind of the authenticity of it, but the characters being transgender is just a fact about the character. It isn't centered. I think there's a couple of scenes where, you know, you can see that there's a conflict with his parents, but, you know, beyond that, it's not an issue. It's just this character is transgender. Here's their backstory, which shows a little bit of strife with their parents. That's it. Let's carry on.
Well, something I'm noticing where it's happening quite a lot at the moment, and it's happening in a very, very cool way, is in cartoons, in children's media. There's a new cartoon of She-Ra from on Netflix, and
which is really, really good, actually.
Really good. Like, just absolutely compulsively brilliant. I mean, I loved not only is it really clever, like the way it draws, it takes away the sort of mythological elements of the original cartoon, and it actually places everything in a twisted family dynamic. So you've got Shadow Weaver as the abusive stepmother, you have Hordak as the sort of domineering father figure.
Which is instantly more recognisable and interesting than the kind of fantasy archetypes, which made sense in the 80s, but just don't translate now.
Don't translate now, but each of the characters now has complexity as well. I mean, Hordak actually had in the last season a kind of moment, you know? A moment of sympathy.
Favourite example of this, sorry, I've got to butt in, is, believe it or not, there's a Transformers franchise comic series, which unfortunately has come to an end now.
More than meets
it is more than meets the eye. So I started reading this because my husband is the biggest Transformers nerd of all time, and he started reading it. So I've never really had much of an interest in Transformers. I watched it when I was a kid in the 80s, and it was great. But, you know, as an adult, it was a relic of my childhood, a bit nostalgia fuel. So he said, "Oh, read this comic," and I said, "Oh, do I have to? It's Transformers. It's just going to be robots fighting each other." I lived through that in the 80s. He went, "No, no, no, seriously, read this comic." So okay, fine, give it the benefit of the doubt. And it's
It's really good, isn't it?
incredible. It's actually one of the best comics I've ever read.
Yeah.
And the way that there's obviously Transformers defaulting to male as we've always accepted. So the writer James Roberts has basically said if hate is a concept that exists in the Transformers universe, as it clearly does, then love must also exist as a parallel emotion. So then you have this incredibly well sketched, realistic, and a genuinely emotional relationship between these two male robots.
Chrome Dome and Rewind.
Oh my god, my heart. I'm not going to spoil it because if you're listening to this and you're even vaguely interested, please, I urge you go and read it.
Read it. It's really good.
It's one of the best queer stories in fiction I've read in my life. It's a great. I mean, the comic is great anyway, especially if you've got like a red dwarf sense of humor. Yeah,
The interpersonal relationships are fantastic. Megatron, I mean, my god.
Megatron is not what you would expect Megatron to be. It's very clever what they do with Megatron.
Bloody. He has moments in that comic where it was like, okay.
Yeah, the bits where I think I never thought I'd find myself actually kind of liking Megatron, but holy shit, I actually kind of like Megatron. The sense of humour, everything about it is just spot on. But that particular, the Chrome Dome and Rewind relationship is just, and what I really like about that, and I think it's something that we need more of in queer fictions, is the idea that they are allowed to also be imperfect.
Yeah. Oh yeah, because it's not a stable relationship. There are problems here.
It's a realistic relationship. It's a real relationship with real problems and issues, and but it's equally not a problematic relationship either. It's real. It just feels real, and that's such a refreshing thing. Who'd have thought that the realest queer relationship I've read in a long time would be in space traveling robot comic.
Yep, giant transforming alien robots from the 1980s. Yeah.
Yet here I am crying over two gay robots in love.
I remember reading it, and I know it sounds like such a cliche thing to say, but I was born in 1984, so the same year the Transformers came out, and I've been a lifelong fan of that. I'm going to a Transformers convention tomorrow, actually.
Is it of what was previously known as TFCon?
The TF Nation, yeah.
TF Nation. I went to that a few years ago.
Did you? I would have been there.
Did you really? I cosplayed as well.
I saw you.
Yeah.
I actually saw you. Oh my! Oh,
How bizarre!
how
That's
strange
so funny.
is that?
It's a great con. I really enjoyed it.
It is lots of fun, actually. It is loads of fun. But yes, I'll be going there tomorrow.
And I'll enjoy it on my behalf as well.
I absolutely will. But to actually like read now as a gay guy, these things that you've grown up with and identified with, because they were very important to me. They were very important growing up, and to find these. That they're actually exploring the kind of emotional relationships that you have in such a respectful way is amazing. It's something I actually find difficult to express,
Definitely, it's the importance of having that. Not just for our generation, because of course our generation are going to find it incredibly important because of the legacy that it has for us, and seeing ourselves represented in this childhood fiction of ours that we probably never thought that we would ever.
I just it never would have occurred to me.
So the new generation, the younger generation coming through, who are experiencing this for the first time and just feeling at home instantly, and that's a beautiful thing for me. That is, I want that for all young. For all young queer kids, I want them all to be able to see, and not even just queer kids. Let's open it up. Everybody of every identity that isn't regularly depicted in media. I want them all to be able to just open a comic or open a book or play a game or watch a film or a TV show and see themselves somewhere and feel like they're
This opens the floodgates, doesn't it? What this does is it allows for more positive, say, male relationships, say, sort of straight male relationships. It allows for better. It allows not for these ridiculous sort of antagonistic, necessarily violent relationships, which have always been part and parcel of children's media, sadly. They've just been part and parcel of our cultures. Now that's changing.
Yeah, more sort of male friendships and affection between male friends. Take away the shame, take away that's this is not how boys behave. And I think by normalizing that, you are going to see a knock-on effect with male mental health, because you're then normalizing friendships, you're normalizing support systems, you're normalizing emotion. All of this is healthy, and all of this is what is needed. It's good for this is why I've never really understood the whole the whole argument that it's somehow feminizing or whatever bullshit buzzword you want to use for it, because it's good for men as well.
Good for men as well.
Arguably, men stand more to gain out of it than women, because
We'll stop dying, won't we?
absolutely, that's all you need to say. That's the core of it, isn't it?
We'll stop harming ourselves and beating ourselves up emotionally and psychologically.
And dying alone and miserable and scared because you feel like you can't talk to anybody. Nobody deserves that, and we are, by opening this, we are creating a world where that doesn't have to happen. Now that should be, all of us should be behind that.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I don't want to count chickens, but I think that will happen, barring some catastrophic reversion. I think that will happen.
I think we've come too far in this direction for us to go all the way back.
Yeah.
I do. I think even if we take a few steps back on the way to getting there, I think we will get there eventually.
We've had a taste now, haven't we? I think we've started to have a taste, and I've seen it in my lifetime. I've seen, like, straight guys and the way they relate to one another change. I've seen it change. There are so many more physically and emotionally able men now who are able to hug one another, who are able to actually express affection for one another than there used to be.
Yeah, which is a really important and wonderful thing. It really is. It's just, I just, there's no downside. There isn't.
There isn't any downside to it. That's the thing. It will save us. It will save your children, And it's sad to me that there are people who would resist it out of some, I don't know, some sort of monomaniacal historical sense of what.
Because that's all how it's always been, and dying of cancer is how it's always been, but we're trying to change that. It's
Exactly.
Just because something has always been a certain way doesn't mean it's good.
Exactly that. Yes, you're absolutely correct. It doesn't mean that it's positive, and in this instance, it is objectively not. It's that weird dying on the hill thing, where, if this is the way it is, if this is what it means to be a man, then so be it. Well, no. We have the means of changing it now.
Except that, it's not just you dying on the hill, it's you dragging a hell of a lot of men down with you. And that's, and it comes back to the idea of responsibility, doesn't it? And this is why I think, narratives of, I'm going to say narratives where male fragility is allowed. I think Paul Tremblay in Cabin at the End of the World handled that very well. Kit Power in The Finite handles that very well. I mean, there's a lot of male authors out there that are touching on the idea that it's okay for a man to be vulnerable, and it's important actually for men to feel vulnerable. And I think I was kind of rereading The Road.
Yes.
Read Kit Power's The Finite, and what stands out to me in that is the way that The Father in the Road, which is an amazing book and one of my absolute favourite books, but is clearly of a different era, because The Father in the Road is stoic to a fault.
Yeah.
And you could even argue that it is his stoicism that kills him.
It ultimately kills him. Yeah, I mean, I would certainly go down that way. Yeah.
Read something like Kit Power's The Finite, and you've got a different, ostensibly the same type of narrative, although it's handled very differently, but the father in that story is a different father.
Completely different character, isn't he? He's a different archetype of what a father is. He's a more modern archetype. He's a more present day archetype.
He is, and I think when I look at the two fathers, and I think, what one would I rather be my father? Put me down for the guy in The Finite any day of the week, because there's a father who cares. And not to say the father in the road doesn't care. He clearly cares very, very much.
Yeah, but he's already dead, isn't he?
Yes, that's exactly it. That is, I couldn't have put it better myself. He is already dead. Yeah.
From the very beginning of the book, he sacrificed himself on that hill of masculinity. That's
There's no need for it to have happened. That's the frustrating thing about it. It didn't have to happen that way. Even though from the point that we join the story, it's in motion, it's unstoppable, it's inevitable, but you can trace it back just far enough that you can see that it could have happened differently.
yeah. Yeah, and in fact, I mean, you could take it even further in many respects. The world itself in The Road has been destroyed by these exact assumptions, by these dynamics that we've allowed for, these historical dynamics. So in many respects, the world is a reflection of what he's expressing, of this stoicism. It's very dark.
It is extremely dark, yeah. I mean, the finite is dark as well, but it's dark in a way that there's. I think what I really appreciate about the finite is there is always a small glimmer of hope in it, even at the very darkest moments.
It's the humanity that comes through, isn't there? There is the connections between the characters. There's the emotion.
Belief that not everything is lost. There's still something worth saving.
I think that's the difference, isn't it? I think that's probably the difference between Kit and Cormac McCarthy, to be honest, because Cormac's books are generally nihilistic. I mean, they are generally nihilistic. They are these very cold commentaries on the nature of a certain preconception of the nature of humanity, and they tend to be despairing.
Yeah, and then when you read something by Kit, you see that that his love for people and his belief in people, no matter how bad things are, and no matter how negative things are, his belief in the basic good of humanity is always present.
Well, it's a bit like Terry Pratchett in that regard, isn't it? Neil Gaiman described Terry Pratchett as a really angry guy. He said he was a very angry man, and but he also added that, well, of course he was angry. You wouldn't be that angry if you didn't care about humanity. If you didn't actually care, you wouldn't be that angry. And I think the same is true of Kit. I mean, we've had conversations where we've both gotten very, very angry at the state of the world.
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely had one or two of those conversations with him myself.
But you wouldn't. It's not despairing. That's the thing. It's not despairing because, of course, you wouldn't be that angry if there wasn't a kind of activism there.
Yeah, and that's the power of horror, isn't it? That kind of brings us full circle to what we were saying earlier on about, it being this kind of this drive, this driven by empathy. And horror, I think, sees the bad in the world, but it also pulls out what's good within that bad.
At its very best, I think you're right. At its bravest and at its best, it allows us to examine those things. It allows us to look at them and hold them up, sometimes to transform them, sometimes even to find some degree of celebration in them.
Yeah, definitely. And the idea there is a better way. I mean, I think I mentioned The Stand earlier on by Stephen King, and it's an epic undertaking, but the conclusion of that story is that even though all these terrible things have happened and that there were these terrible people in the world, there is also so much good, and there is so much worth saving, and that it was worth it, that all of that undertaking and everything those characters went through was worth it.
Yeah.
And that's what I want from my horror. I want my horror to tell me that after it's dragged me through all these terrible things, and after it's kicking and screaming pulled me through these nightmarescapes, that there is something at the end of it all.
That you've been transformed by it. Yeah, that you've been altered by it somehow, and you've had some sort of revelation. And it is, I mean, I don't want to get too controversial about it, but it is something that a great deal of horror fiction misses a lot of the time, It doesn't have that element to it, and that does depress me sometimes. I think it misses a dimension or a depth of flavour that it could otherwise have. But when it does, and when it gets it right, it's beautiful. One of my favourite writers is Clive Barker, and he does it a lot.
He does it a lot, and he does it extremely well. And when you think about when Clive Barker kind of, when he first started writing, and when he, when he hit the big time, so to speak, was a time of, the heyday of the slasher film. It was the heyday of the very violent and very nihilistic horror narrative. So he was simple. And he was very ahead of the curve in that. And I think he was
like light years.
He was kind of prophetic, really, if you like. A prophet of what what horror would become and what horror should become.
Absolutely, I totally agree. I mean, the thing I always get from Barker's work is when you read it in context with the stuff that's happening at the time, like in the mid to late 1980s, early 1990s, is there's nothing like him out there.
Absolutely not, and that's I think that's why a lot of people were drawn to him. You know, as I said, I was reading horror at an inappropriately young age, and
Likewise, likewise. My mum gave me Weave World at 11.
oh,
Yeah,
that's wow.
yeah, I know, right?
I thought reading Cujo at 11 was bad, but whoa.
Yeah, right.
But in a way, assuming you can handle the kind of themes and the kind of, you know, why not? It's, you know, your mind is so malleable at that age.
It blew my mind.
I think of far worse lessons to learn at 11 than.
It's formed things. I mean, it actually blew my mind wide open. All the parameters came off. So all the stuff that had been conditioned into me by Tolkien and Lewis and about fantasy and about metaphysical fiction was just blown apart by it.
There is another way, there is another option.
A better way.
Yeah, you don't have to look at it like this. Which is a powerful thing at that age. It's a very powerful thing.
Well, I dread to think what I would have been without it, to be honest, because to go forward in life with those very narrow preconceptions of what relationships are and what women are and what metaphysics is, and, you know, I shudder to think. It could have been like I could have been really right-wing or really conservative, you know. It could have happened. It could have happened without
influences in life. I mean, you know, I grew up, so, you know, my dad was quite right. Well, I say I know he's very right wing actually, and he was only really around for the first 9 years of my life as a major influence. But you know, when I think about that, you know, those are very formative years, aren't they? And you know, and I had beliefs as a young age that I am not proud of having, but it's external influences, and yeah, fictional. A lot of fiction that opened the world to me and showed me that there was a different way to look at things. So having access to this was before the internet really as well.
Yeah.
So now it's slightly different because, you know, you can find these things everywhere.
Yeah, you can go direct to the source, can't you? Actually go and talk to these people. Yeah.
But back then you only really had what was in a book.
Yeah.
So having access to books that told me different stories was so important and vital.
Spiritually essential, yeah. It just stuff coming in from outside the household.
Yeah, and you know, stuff outside the household, outside my household experience, but also outside my personal experience as well. Just show me that, you know, the world is not just what one person tells me it's like.
Of course, yeah. Wow, that's There's actually a whole raft of themes and stories to be written from that very concept, is there not?
100%, yeah. And I actually think it's those are the stories that we ought to be telling at the moment. Actually, you know, and I guess that's part of the reason why I try and include a range of different characters. Mm-hmm. You know, in different ways. You know, different living different lives and coming from different places and having just different perspectives, because I don't want to just limit.
Yeah. You don't want people existing in their own little tribes exclusively.
And I don't want to build worlds that are the same world over and over again.
Of course. It's, well, if just purely on an experiential level, it's boring, isn't it?
Extremely boring, and the thing is, I end up telling the same story over and over because that's what happens. Let's be honest. If you never go outside of your own limited, you know, this is what I'm comfortable writing. Fine, that's great. You never go outside of that. You end up telling the same story over and over again.
Don't get me wrong. You know, some writers do that all the time, and they've made a massive career out of it. I mean, James Patterson does that all the time.
Writers do it, you know, very well, and that's what some people want from their storytelling, and there's a place for that. You know, that's okay. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but that's not what I want to be as a writer.
Nor me. It's just not. I would feel bad,
and I would feel unfulfilled as well. I think
it's almost like you're shortchanging the reader, isn't it? You know.
You know, there's so many stories I want to tell and so many ideas I want, but also because there are so many different kinds of ideas I want to explore, they can't be explored in that same sphere. You have to
Of
go outside
course.
of that in order to tell those stories. I couldn't have told in the City of Bones in any other way than I did, because
Yeah.
I needed the outsider's perspective. I needed the
Hmm.
outside environment. I needed
Yeah.
the isolation, both mentally and physically. I needed all of those things. Those ingredients had to be
Yeah, to make it work.
exactly. So when I said it, and I didn't set it in Siberia because I want to set it as far away as possible and have this, specific experience. It was
Mm.
I need isolation.
Yeah.
I need these ingredients. So it was more those choices served the story, not the other way
Hmm.
around.
Of course, yeah, and there's also, I mean, I don't know whether this was conscious or what, but there's almost a chromatic element as well, like the sort of the glaring red of the Harlequin ichthyosis against the white.
That's really interesting, actually. Yeah, that wasn't a conscious choice, but that is a very interesting thing to kind of pick up on.
Yeah, it made it very visual for me to read it. It made it very visual because I have seen what people with Harlequin ichthyosis tend to look like, and that very rubricated skin against the whiteness of the snow and the paleness of the concrete, very stark, very interesting.
I think I'm a very visual writer. I see things as I
Yeah.
write, so that's just it. Just kind of happens that way.
Hmm.
I've heard that there are some writers that don't visualize.
Yeah, I've heard that, and I can't. I read that very recently, and I actually learned for the first time recently that there are people who don't have images in their heads.
Yeah, which is fascinating to me because I've always had images in my head
I
to the point where actually it's a little bit worrying sometimes.
Yeah, likewise, and I actually I can't understand it. I find it really hard to get a grasp on, like, how does thought work then? How does the mind function, you know?
Equally, the friends that I've spoken to that experience this
Yeah,
can't comprehend how it works for me either. So
absolutely. Yeah,
that's
that
equally
I mean,
fascinating.
I would love to have some sort of device that would allow me to jack into their minds and experience how it operates.
Yeah, definitely. Just to have that kind of perspective because I don't know. It sounds fascinating. It's just
Yeah,
how
totally.
how do you see the world? And I don't even mean that in a your world must be lesser because I don't
No,
think
no.
that. Just genuinely interesting to me.
Not in a derogatory way, not at all. No, in the sense that it's a totally removed state of mind. It's something I can't actually. Ironically, I can't imagine.
Yeah, well, I guess there's kind of the answer there a little bit, isn't it? But yeah, I can't envision that. I can't see it.
To the point whereby when I read this, and it was very recently, I was like, I did not know that.
I had no idea. But I guess see that's. I'm sure there are people out there writing stories with characters that feel that way. And I hope there are actually, because I feel like everybody, like I said earlier, everybody deserves to read a story that they can see themselves in.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean that would be a fantastic, interesting thing to write.
From the perspective of those of us who don't have that experience, it's very important for us to understand it in some
Yeah.
way. That's equally
Yeah.
important to me, I think.
Yeah, to understand, yeah, because you are getting a meeting of two very different states of mind, and I would love to read a story from the perspective of someone who operates like that.
But it's fascinating, and I bet it's I'd love to kind of look at that way of seeing the world. I guess the thing with writers is I think we collect experiences sometimes,
Yeah.
don't we? I think
Oh yeah.
I certainly do. I'm an experienced magpie. I go
Yeah.
around and
Likewise.
if it's interesting to me, I kind of just squirrel it away in my brain and think, oh,
Hmm.
that's something to think about.
I was actually talking to my boyfriend recently about it. I was in a cafe, a train station cafe in Wolverhampton, waiting to be picked up by friends, and it's one of my favourite places to be, like train stations, airports, places where people are in transition. Yeah, because you can watch, and people are so interesting when they're in transition. They're so interesting when they've got timetables to keep, when they've got places to be, people to meet, when they're going to meet, I don't know, they're going to meet maybe an affair or something like that, or they're going to a job, or they're going to a football match, or a theatre production, or they're going to meet a friend they haven't seen for years, or whatever. It's so interesting.
They kind of lose the self-consciousness, don't they? It kind of, and then you just kind of get this kind of pure experience of the person.
You start to see the little anxieties and the little tics and twitches that they try to hide from like the waking world, which I love.
No, I agree with you. That is, people watching in those kind of places is quite
it's great fun.
In a completely non-stalkerish way.
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah, it's because we're doing it as writers, it makes it romantic and not stalkery. That's my excuse too. And it's the grottiest little cafe. I love that too. The fact that it is so grotty and dirty, and the coffee tastes like rainwater filtered through cigarette ash,
That's all part of the experience, isn't it?
Great. It's great. I love it. I absolutely love it. But yes, oh wow, I think we may have exhausted this one to death, Laura. Is there anything you'd like to say as a closing statement?
Oh God, yeah, we've gone on a little bit, haven't we? If you're my closing statement is, if you're still listening to this, I salute you and thank you.
Yeah, well done, by the way, guys, and thank you so much for listening. I would say, is there anything you want to pimp out? But this whole thing has been a kind of pimp out, really. Is there anything beyond Sing Your Sadness Deep, which there will be, by the way, ladies and gents? Go down below to the bar that's down there, and you will find links to Sing Your Sadness Deep. Please go and take a look. Is there anything extraneous to that you would like to pimp out?
Now you're asking me. I'll just come and say hello to me on Twitter if you're listening and you're vaguely interested, because I like to talk to people. It's nice.
Oh yeah, highly recommended. I like Laura's Twitter very much. Highly recommended. As for myself, you can find me in all the usual places around here on the Exaggerated Elegy channel, over at strangeplaygrounds.com, and at Enigmatic Elegy on Twitter. Thank you so much, Laura, for coming on. It's been a delight.
Thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed chatting with you today.
Once again, if there's anything you'd like to come on and chat about more generally, any subject at all.
Yeah, likewise. Just send me a message and I'll be there. I will talk about most things.
Awesome. That sounds great. Until next time, ladies and gentlemen. Bye-bye.
Ha ha ha!